Science only seeks the truth, but it must be verifiable, leading to a much clearer view of reality. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me on this episode of Nature and Science Podcast. Are we alone in the universe? Are aliens or extraterrestrial beings already here on Earth? Or are they watching us from afar with technologically advanced probes? We're going to explore these and other questions with John Gertz. John has been involved in the field of SETI for more than 20 years, having served 3 terms as chairman of the board. He also serves as the president of a new organization that successfully campaigned to raise $100 million for SETI research, and he currently is the only layman on the Breakthrough Listen Board that advises on the use of that $100 million fund. His forthcoming book, Reinventing SETI, will be released in the spring of 2025 by Oxford University Press. Well, John, thank you for joining us. I really wanted to start off by asking you how you got interested in the search for extraterrestrials in the first place. Were you just excited about aliens or UFOs, or what in the world got you into this in the first place?
Well, honestly, I've always been interested in sort of the big questions of life and evolutionary biology, cosmology, and comparative mythology and religion was something that was fascinated me earlier in my, education.
Right.
But my studies of cosmology and led me to astronomy, of course, and astronomy led me to what are the big questions in astronomy, and certainly the biggest one I could think of was, are we alone in this universe? So I became an amateur astronomer, but with a keen interest in SETI. And by complete fluke of coincidence, the Bay Area where I live was at that time, when I first became involved in SETI around the turn of the millennium, was the hotbed or center of SETI research, both at the University of California at Berkeley and the SETI Institute in Mountain View, California, were really the 2 world leaders of SETI. I happened to meet Jill Tarter, who was one of the great founders of SETI. I had her and her husband over for dinner. As it happened, my wife at the time, when she was an undergraduate, did babysitting for Jill Tarter when she was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. And so I met this SETI community, and one thing led to another, and I was invited onto the board of the SETI Institute.
Why did they invite you on the board? What was it about you that attracted them?
Actually, what attracted them at first was money. I didn't tell you the part of the story where Jill basically agreed to come over for a dinner. My wife at the time had invited her to come for dinner as a surprise for my birthday, knowing how interested I was in SETI and knowing that she knew Jill Tarter. And Jill agreed to come on the condition that she could solicit me for money for what was then the dream and ambition that she had to build a new telescope devoted to SETI that became known, and it was built eventually, became known as the Allen Telescope Array after the chief funder, Paul Allen. After dinner, Jill indeed did ask me for money, but through the course of the dinner, she had found out that I actually had frankly, a pretty deep layman's understanding of the field. And I think it's fair to say that she was pretty impressed with the fact that I did have this great layman's knowledge of the field. Right. So when she came to ask me for money, I turned it on her and I said, listen, Jill, you're being penny wise and pound stupid. Don't ask me for money. Ask me onto your board of directors at the SETI Institute in Mountain View, where I can help you multiply the dollars because I'm an entrepreneur and because I understand the field of SETI and because I've at that time, I had already served on a number of nonprofit boards, and I understood the world of nonprofits.
Sure.
Well, one thing led to another, and I was in fact invited onto the board as at the time, really, I think the only layman on the board. The rest were, world leading astronomers and one or two high technologists of Silicon Valley.
Right, understand. So, Jill, what did what was her vision in the first place? So, how did SETI think that they could search successfully for extraterrestrials? I mean, the vision must have been there are extraterrestrials out there, and we're going to find them. Was that the attitude?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, uh, and maybe it was naive, but the idea was that if there were extraterrestrials out there, the galaxy is pretty much transparent to radio waves. That since we can broadcast radio waves to each other, we just tune into 88.5 on your FM dial, and there are radio waves being broadcast from one place on this planet to another place on this planet, your home or your car. The same thing applies in interstellar space. You can, with a big enough transmitter, you can transmit a radio beacon from one star to another. That was the idea. The idea was that ET is probably sitting on its planet. It's perhaps much more advanced than us, and it's transmitting a signal to us saying, "Hello, how are you, the Earthlings? How's the weather there today? And yeah, are you interested in getting great wisdom and knowledge that we have to transmit?" Okay, so that was the idea. Let's take our big receiving telescope, our radio telescope, and simply point at it star by star by star by star until bingo, eureka, we hit the star that's transmitting to us. Well, honestly, we're still doing this, and that's the predominant paradigm in SETI today. But by this time, honestly, we've looked at probably certainly over 1 million stars. Especially when you count the stars in foreground and the stars in background, and realize that SETI is now going on, not just in the United States and not just by the SETI Institute, but by the Breakthrough Listen Foundation housed at Berkeley and Oxford University and at Penn State and at UCLA and in Italy and South Africa, and very, very particularly now also in China, where they're using the FAST radio telescope, which is the largest radio telescope in the world now, single dish radio telescope in the world, and they're using it for SETI as well. So when you count all the stars that are being looked at, including the ones in the foreground and the background, we have to basically say we've come up dry. And this is perplexing. There's no getting around it. It's downright perplexing. So we have to ask the question, why? Well, what's wrong with the paradigm? And honestly, I've come to the conclusion in a number of papers that I've written in my forthcoming book with Oxford University Press, entitled "Reinventing SETI," which will be out in August, that old paradigm is simply bankrupt. Or nearly so. Not only have we looked at millions of stars and found nothing, but it's my considered opinion that we haven't found anything because there's nothing to find. That ET's, if we look at it from ET's perspective, it's a lousy strategy.
So when you say there's nothing to find, do you mean it's part of the paradigm where we say we're searching for extraterrestrials, but there are no extraterrestrials to find? Or are you saying that there's nothing to find with respect to the techniques that we're using, the radio techniques that we're using? I mean, there are millions of electromagnetic frequencies, so on the spectrum. So
it is. I'll tell you. No, it's the latter, Don. It's the latter. It's basically the problem is that ET is doing one of two things. One is, and I'll come back to this in a second, that the idea of sending radio waves from your own star system to some other star system is just a bad idea. I'll come to that in a second. But if they were to use that technique, they might very well be doing it in frequencies that we cannot detect on Earth, most particularly infrared or high ultraviolet or even X-ray communications, which would be more efficient than radio transmissions. The problem is they don't penetrate our atmosphere. But ET would reason, what kind of intelligent being would put their telescopes at the bottom of the thick atmosphere? It makes no sense. They would put it either in outer space, or they would put it, in our case, on the far side of the moon. And so ET doesn't want to communicate with somebody so primitive or stupid as to put their telescopes at the bottom of the thick atmosphere. Okay.
Before you go on, there's a really important question I want to ask you in that regard, and I don't want to forget it. And so what you seem to be communicating is that if there are extraterrestrials out there, they are more advanced than humanity here on Earth. And if that's the case, there's the assumption that over the 13 billion years of the known universe, there is a chance that civilizations have developed that are far more advanced than ours. But I've also heard it posited that our civilization could be the first of the advanced civilizations in all of the universe. And we could be the first to be sending out signals and then learning in the process. And this is something that doesn't get discussed a lot, but I've heard it talked about by some cosmologists and astronomers. What do you think?
No, is what I think. Actually, think I'll tell you. First of all, the sun is a young star. 95% of all stars are older than the sun. The first stars bearing planets would be roughly 13 billion years old now. Those stars, so in other words, the first stars were planets, and therefore the first star systems with potential for life are 13 billion years old. Let's say that now we know our star is only 4.55 billion years old. And we know it took 4.55 billion years for a technological species to arise on Earth. Let's say that's kind of average. And so let's give it 5 billion years. 13 minus 5 is 8. So 8 billion years ago, the first alien technological civilizations might have begun. That is one large head start that they've got on us. As a matter of fact, what we know very, 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 very little. We don't know nothing about. That's a double negative, but it's not fair to say we know absolutely nothing about ET. We do know a few things about ET, and we can surmise a few others. But one thing that we know for certain, on statistical bases, that whatever aliens that we encounter must be far, far more advanced than ourselves, because the statistical chance that they too are only in the very first 100 years, given 13 billion years of possible evolution, that they also, like us, are in the first 100 years of technological capacity. The capacity to send or receive radio signals is statistically nil.
Right. Well, but also within those statistics, though, if that's the case, then there would have been other civilizations that have developed along that timeline, that perhaps the first extraterrestrials that were able to develop this interstellar or inter-universe kinds of communication, they would have come in contact with other extraterrestrials other than us, that they could communicate with as well. We being relatively young, they wouldn't really care too much about us, would they, if they've come in contact with others along this billions of years timeline, and they've been able to scope out our system, for example, and they say, oh, that system's 4.5 billion years old, they would be able to, calculate, extrapolate. That system may have life on it, but it's not going to be too advanced. So we're not gonna bother with that right now.
It's certainly possible, and certainly that's one of the problems with the old paradigm of looking for transmissions from star systems. Um, you have to ask, why would they do it? What's in it for them? They wouldn't know when we had turned technological, so they would have had to have been beaming a transmission to us 24/7 over millions and billions of years, not knowing exactly when we're going to evolve to the point where we have the capacity to intercept a message. They would have to do it at a very high power. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to receive it. And what exactly are they doing this for? If they're far more advanced than us, I can imagine things that they may want to do. They may want to just tell us what the law is. If you want to exist as a peaceful civilization, you don't move, don't go anywhere, stay where you are, because colonization is absolutely forbidden according to the law of the galaxy, or the meta law of the galaxy. But why would they do this at a very high energy level consistently? It would be so much cheaper for them, and so much more efficient for them to send robotic probes into our solar system. So imagine this: when they're sending a signal, they're getting no information back about us whatsoever. They're not learning anything about Earth. They're just hoping that sooner or later we pick up their transmission, and that we deign to respond to their signal. Otherwise, they're out of luck. They're learning nothing about us. If, however, the far better strategy that they would have would be to send robotic probes to our solar system, and they could have done so 4 billion years ago, send the first ones to see what was going on. They might send a robotic flyby, and having done so, say, 3.5 billion years ago, they would have detected the first life on Earth, signals of the first life, and they would have marked it in their galactic atlas as a biologic planet. That would have warranted continued flybys and surveys, and maybe still at the rate of only one every 100 million years, until perhaps they realized that life had become multicellular. And now it becomes a little bit more interesting. And then they could put probes into permanent orbit around our planet, or in our solar system, around our sun, to further study us and surveil us. Eventually,
Well, this means, but doesn't this mean, even in that paradigm, that these extraterrestrials that would send out this kind of probe, perhaps starting 4 or 5 billion years ago, and it takes, I don't know, because I don't know where the extraterrestrials live in the universe, but it would take many, many light years for that probe to reach the Earth. So these extraterrestrials would have to be so sophisticated that they would have to have the capacity to do cataloging that would survive in their civilization, provided they don't live forever as individuals, cataloging this information over millions and millions and millions of years. And at some point in their evolution and in their development, they would reap the result of these probes that they're sending out, because it certainly wouldn't be instantaneous.
That's if you were simply thinking in terms of one civilization. But if there was a network of civilizations that are connected by these probes, so that these probes are like pearls on a string connecting the entire galaxy, with probes in orbit around virtually every star, in communication with one another, and that information is constantly being uploaded, not to a single civilization, but to this network. And as a consequence, information about civilizations constantly grows and is independent of the continued existence of any one civilization. So even if a civilization it becomes extinct, the information about them lives, just as the Library of Congress is filled with books by dead authors. It doesn't matter. The information in the Library of Congress continues to grow.
So you're proposing in this new paradigm that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that we should be searching for these probes or this network, or trying to somehow communicate with this network and glean information that might be available to us vis-a-vis this network. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. Eventually, these probes who are in our solar system right now, uh, maybe they're sitting on asteroids, maybe on the moon, maybe they're in orbit around the sun, close orbit around the sun. But these probes are uploading information all the time from Earth. They're learning our language from Sesame Street. They're learning our math from Khan Academy. They're learning the rest from YouTube. And eventually, when they've learned enough about us, they can communicate with us and do so in real time, as opposed to the back and forth that would take light years, depending on the distance of the star in terms of light years. But do so in almost real time if they're just simply light minutes away from Earth, or even light seconds away from Earth, and be able to convey information to us in, frankly, the Queen's own English if they've learned it, and do so again in real time. Moreover, the cost of the information that they're bearing with us, all the payload of this probe, the informational payload of this probe, whatever they want to download to Earth, can be on their equivalent of a thumb drive or a small hard drive or something. That's vastly cheaper for them to bring that with them from interstellar space, or from some other star system, than it is to transmit that same information over millions and billions of years.
So these extraterrestrials would have had to have programmed these probes with some sort of algorithm that, as they receive information, it's like machine learning with an AI. As they learn from signals that they get from the Earth, they then get to a certain point in their learning that something else kicks in. The algorithm says, okay, now we're at a point where we've learned enough that we can get into this loop where we can send information back to the
Yes.
civilization that we've gleaned information from.
Yes, yes, and possibly no. The probe may not be autonomous. The probe may, in fact, be uploading its information to some home base or some progenitor civilization, which in turn is possibly because it doesn't have the analytical abilities to study us in enough depth, possibly because they don't have the authority to make the decision as to whether or not to open communications with us, or ignore us and study us some more, or possibly to destroy us as a threat to the peace-loving civilizations of the galaxy. They may not have that authority. So it may be that they're sending signals back to a progenitor civilization, or a nodal civilization, or a home-based civilization that might be, say, 1,000 light years away. In which case it may not be for another 2,000 years.
2000.
That the local probes have the authority or enough depth of knowledge to be able to transmit back to us. So we may have a long wait on our hands, and that anything we try to do in the meantime is sort of futile in trying to discover them, because once they do open a line of communication with us, we won't need a sophisticated telescope. It may be that virtually any amateur telescope will notice a brand new laser in the sky, or a star that in a place where wasn't a star the other day, and realized it's monochromatic and is a laser and not a star at all, or that it's beaming radio waves that simply take over 88.5 on our FM dial or something like this. It may be so obvious it's past the interlocutory test. In other words, it smacks us right between the eyes. But it may take another 1,000 or 2,000 years for us to get that signal. In the meantime, there's nothing we can do but wait. On the other hand, and I want to sort of leave that topic with some hope, that when you ask the question, why would ET even bother communicating with us when they're billions of years in advance of us? And the reason is, in my judgment, is that they need us. We actually have bargaining power with the aliens. And what do they need us for? When I imagine a nodal system or a system of relay stations around the galaxy, not only around every star, but possibly in multiple relay satellites or probes in between stars, conveying the message onwards. No one civilization can build out and maintain that kind of elaborate system where it could involve trillions of probes. Rather, they need us on Earth to help maintain that nodal communication system in at least our little quadrant of the galaxy, by like building and repairing our own probes that may not be much more elaborate than in terms of what it would take to build one than we can already do in a car factory.
Well, you seem to be positing that if they do communicate with us, you just said because they need us, then the first signal that we may get back is, hello, how are you? We know you're there. We know you have a certain amount of technological ability. Hey, you want to help us explore the universe? You seem to be explorers. You've sent stuff to Mars, blah, blah, blah. You're on the moon now. You've got probes all around Venus and Saturn, and even as far as the end of your solar system, you've landed on asteroids. You seem to be about there. So you're saying they would communicate to us, hey, how about joining us in doing something even more sophisticated from what they've learned from us with the probe, you say, that may be in our solar system now. They would have the ability to communicate to us then how to actually build out these probes. But that assumes that they've learned an awful lot about our language and our technology and the ability to communicate to us how to build such a system.
Right. And, this is one of the main problems with the old paradigm of is that when they're not up close and personal with us, as I posit with their probes being right here in our own solar system surveilling us, they don't know how to communicate with us. Maybe they communicate among themselves with bee-like waggle dances, belly dances, maybe with cuttlefish-like color schemes. Maybe it's with, maybe their sensory modalities may be entirely different. I mean, my dog and I seem to understand each other on one sort of level, but when I take her for a walk and she's smelling all the bushes, I have no idea what world of sensory smells she's entering into, and and she, why blotches or splotches of urine are so interesting for her, and I don't think she has a way of communicating to me that level of interest. Even if she could speak perfect English, like we would have nothing to talk about. And then there's an intellectual gap potentially between ET and ourselves, much so that if I got into a room with a Homo habilis, I couldn't exactly explain to him about Einstein or Shakespeare or anything, and I surely wouldn't have a lot of use for his, his skin scrapers or something. So there are all kinds of problems of communication that ET would have with us, and there's only one way that ET can solve that, and that's to come here, study us, and learn how it is that we actually do communicate.
Hmm. So, as I was saying earlier, these probes would be similar to AI with machine learning. They would just be fed all this data from the Earth that this probe would be able to gather. The ET would have to have developed some sort of algorithm or some ability to sift through this data to make sense of it, so that they could develop a communication scheme. And you're saying that's what's possible.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I think that,
Mhm.
and I can't imagine how they could do that from a large distance without coming here and studying us. Now,
Yeah,
it could be argued that there is a special case here that of what I would call what's been called the I Love Lucy
right.
radio, where in effect we've been sending strong television signals since about 1950 in all directions. Omnidirectional signals have been going out, and at this point, we could be hearing back from for roughly 70 years. Those signals have gone out. So half of that would be 35 years or 35 light years. We could be hearing from civilizations 35 light years away. And that's a special case. And we really should be studying stars that are within 35 light years of ourselves. But understand that even those stars would be hard pressed to be learning very much about Earth from viewing I Love Lucy, because they would need a humongous radio telescope in order to discern the signal, or to decipher or decode the signal that is embedded within the carrier wave of that television signal. They would need a telescope that would be 10,000 times larger
Sure.
to detect the actual content of that signal than to just detect the carrier wave.
Well, let's circle back to kind of an original, question embedded in the old paradigm, and it's a little bit historical, and that has to do with Fermi's paradox, Drake's equation, which communicated that there's a tremendous Fermi's paradox, which I suppose really isn't a paradox, and you can talk about that if you'd like, and Drake's equation, which even I, as a non-cosmologist, I mean, as a molecular biologist, I used to look at Drake's equation and go, "What?" You can, maybe talk about that a little bit, and but Fermi's paradox, talking about trying to answer the question of why we haven't heard from these aliens if they exist. You want to talk about that for a minute and tell us what that paradox is or isn't?
Well, first of all, what it isn't is a paradox. I don't know why it's called a paradox. Um, but and it's also not something that Fermi ever apparently posited. He was interested in the question of why it is that aliens haven't traveled to Earth, not whether or not they actually exist. So I don't like the term for Fermi's paradox, and prefer to go with David Brin's recasting of it as the Great Silence. But the question still poses itself as to if the first aliens could be 8 or 9 billion years more advanced than ourselves. Well, why is it exactly that this isn't obvious to us? Why can't we just look up at the night sky and see evidence of ET as clearly as we can see the full moon? And that's a real head scratcher. And that's the big question here. Why is it that we see no one? And the one obvious possibility is that we are absolutely and utterly alone in at least the galaxy, if not the universe. That's a lot of stars out there to be lifeless. And what we know already is that planets are ubiquitous. There are planets around virtually every star, and not just planets, not a planet, but planets, that planetary systems are ubiquitous. Just like our planet, our solar system, our sun has a system of planets around it. So that's one obvious possibility, that we are in fact alone. I don't think that that's correct, but at this point we don't know. But there have been easily 100 solutions offered to the great silence. I'll tell you just briefly some of my favorites. One is that, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking in the wrong way. We're looking in radio and in optical lasers, but ET may be transmitting in high ultraviolet or X-rays, and that do not penetrate our atmosphere. So that's one possibility. Another possibility that I think is, unfortunately, I can't find any logical reason why this may not be correct, because it's kind of a scary one, is that that there isn't just one civilization, ourselves, but two, ourselves and just one other, and that one other is what's been called a berserker civilization. It's a civilization that kills all others, just like a queen bee, when it emerges from its cell, immediately turns around and kills all the other queen bees that have not yet emerged from their cells. That this civilization simply wants no competition, views all other emerging civilizations as a threat, and that those probes that I talked about are actually here, but they're here to kill us, in a sense. And that one day we'll all wake up and see that a comet is, or we observe a comet coming at us from the Oort cloud, and we say, oh gosh, bad luck there, and we try to build some shelters and so at least somebody can survive and so forth. And sure enough, we notice the second one coming at us, and a third one, and a fourth one, and the end is well nigh. Unfortunately, I think that might, but the one solution to the great silence that I favor the most, you might imagine, is my own solution, and that is that that the galaxy is laced with communication probes and nodes of communication, or relay stations, and they communicate through narrow-beamed lasers, which would be probably the most efficient way for them to communicate amongst themselves. And very simply, we're not in the communication pathways. These are thin pencil lines of lasers. They spread out with distance from the probe. We can discuss that, but by and large, they're thin, and we're simply not in any of those communication pathways, probably intentionally, because ET doesn't want us to be in the pathway. So you can think of it as the kind of lasers that they have in museums or garage openers. These are lasers that communicate with each other, and we're simply not in one of it. So there's actually a whole cacophony of communication going on all around us, but we're simply not in the communication pathways.
Mm-hmm. Well, wouldn't another possibility be, I think you've already mentioned, is that there are so many ways that species, even on the face of the earth, communicate. And I can only imagine that in a universe as expansive as the known universe is, there could be trillions of modes of communication. So another solution could simply be that there are, communications networks out there that you seem to already imply that we just can't receive,
Right.
or even be able to comprehend if we could receive them. So that's possible as well.
That would be an enormous challenge in and of itself, but first we have to receive them, and
Mhm.
and If
Right.
we're not in the pathways, then we simply can't receive them. Or if it's in a frequency that we can't receive at the bottom of our atmosphere, we have to be on the far side of the moon to receive. These are possibilities.
Right. And so then that leads us to talk about Drake's equation as well. Can you say a few words about that rather long equation, which, just like Fermi's paradox, really isn't a paradox? I know I looked at this, in the beginning, and I have a pretty extensive math background and science background, and I said, that doesn't look like an equation to me.
No,
Am I wrong?
no, and I have to tell you that. Let me preface this by saying that Frank Drake was a very close friend of mine. I worked with him very closely for years. A lovely, lovely, lovely human being. And his equation, and a very modest man. And the first to admit that, I think, to quote him in one of his writings, that it took no great intellectual prowess on my part to develop this. And he was being not falsely modest. In fact, the Drake equation is worthless and is ready for the ash bin of history. It's really ready to be cast aside. There isn't a single term in it that makes any sense anymore. I could go on. I can't give you a short answer on this, but I can give you quite a long answer by going term by term and telling you and showing you how each single term in the equation
Well, I'll
is.
be putting this up on a screen on the video so that people can actually see both Drake's equation and understand also what Fermi's paradox looks like as well. So our viewers and listeners will get a chance to see that as well.
All right. So do you want me to run through the equation?
Sure,
All
sure.
right. So the equation, Drake's equation, starts with n. N is the number of civilizations who are communicating with us at this time in the universe. In order to derive that, let's start with all of the factors and pick them apart. R prime, completely useless. It's the rate of star formation in the galaxy right now. I have no idea what Frank was thinking when he threw that into the equation. But the n has no relationship to the current rate of star formation. What Frank was thinking about was that we know that there is approximately one star like the sun, like our sun, that is being created in the galaxy right now every year. But this rate of star formation is much lower today than it was in the earlier period, and the current rate is irrelevant to that. What is relevant is the number of stars that might be able to host civilizations. Well, Frank was under the notion that only stars like our own, because ours is the best of all possible worlds, as you well know, only like our own or stars like our own could host life, and that would be a nice, warm, friendly G star, as it's called. But there's no reason to believe that other stars can't host life as well. So really, the only thing you really care about is how many stars are in the galaxy that could host life, and that's roughly 200 billion to 400 billion, depending on certain estimates. Okay. The next factor is n sub p. I'm sorry, F sub p, which is the fraction of those stars that have planets. Well, we already know that Frank didn't know that when he devised the equation in 1961, I think it was. But now we do know the answer to that. The answer is that all stars have planets. Well, 1 times anything is the same thing. And so any factor in the Drake equation that is a 1 or 100% can come out. It doesn't reduce anything whatsoever. So F sub p comes out. N sub e, which is the number of Earth-like planets in each of these solar system. Well, again, Frank was under the blinkered notion that um, only planets like Earth, because Earth is the best of all possible worlds, could host life. But now we know that simply isn't true. I mean, we know that for one simple fact, because the Earth and the Moon are in the exact same spot. The Earth is blossoming with life, and the Moon is dead as a doorknob, and yet they're the exact same distance from the sun. But the obvious difference is, of course, is that the Earth has an atmosphere and liquid water. But if you look at when life first began, uh, at least 3.8 billion years ago, and probably considerably longer ago than that, the sun was much dimmer than it is today. About 70% of the luminosity of what it is currently, so that the Earth should have been a frozen ice ball, and yet obviously was not, and life came to be. Well, the reason for that, again, is the atmosphere. The atmosphere wasn't as it was today. It was filled with all sorts of warming gases, or gases that kept the heat in the planet. Same thing with Mars. Mars was even further away from the sun, and yet there was water flowing on the surface of the planet, again, because it had a thick atmosphere, probably almost all carbon dioxide. But then you look at that life doesn't necessarily need to begin on the surface of a planet. It can begin beneath
Sure.
an ice shelf, such as on the moon of Europa, or of the Jovian moon of Europa, or the Saturn's moon of Enceladus. In fact, even Pluto is suggested to have an ocean, a subsurface ocean. So now then, when you go into the universe, from the solar system, you see that Venus is obviously completely inhospitable to life on its surface right now. It's hot as hell, and so forth. But up in the clouds of Venus, there are levels of the clouds where the temperatures are very Earth-like and temperate, and where in fact phosphine it has been detected, although there's some controversy over that, and time here doesn't allow me to get too deeply into that. But we're to the point where we've said that if life can exist anywhere from the clouds of Venus to the oceans of Pluto, and include everything in between, including life as we may not know it in the oceans or lakes of Titan, which are hydrocarbon lakes instead of liquid water lakes, then what's the whole point of a habitable system? And if you don't believe me, or this idea of this habitable zone that's very restricted, and if you don't believe me, believe NASA.
Sure.
NASA spends billions of dollars on expeditions now to Europa and Enceladus and Pluto and so forth in the quest for life.
Well, even here on Earth, you know, that it indicates that. I mean, you have the thermal vents in the ocean that harbor life. At Yellowstone National Park, and of course, I was with the national park for years, and you have the thermal vents there that harbor life, and that have done a great deal in informing us about biochemistry and molecular biology, from very areas that we would think would be inhospitable to life, but they harbor bacteria that are extremely important. So, clearly what you're saying with respect to that particular variable in Drake's equation, you can even see that from looking at the various areas on the Earth where we would, on the surface of it, think that there isn't life.
Right. Absolutely true. Moreover, we haven't even barely begun to scratch the surface of what is beneath the surface.
Sure.
Okay, there are whole ecosystems beneath the surface of the Earth, and we don't know for a fact that all life is like the life we know of on the surface of the Earth, that's based on DNA and RNA of a certain type and using the same amino acids and so forth and so on. There could be strange life that we have yet to identify, even here on planet Earth. In other words, life may have begun not once, but on multiple occasions on Earth. And in fact, we can say that and when we look at the next factor, F sub L, which is the fraction of planets that have life, we can, and by the way, Frank was way too restrictive in saying it's the fractions of planets. It should be the fractions of anything. It could be the fractions, it can be the, because life begins not just on a planet, but also on a moon. Even when you consider a planet, you have to consider every hydrothermal vent, every puddle, every tide pool has its own little petri dish and its own little opportunity in which life may have begun, and it only needed to begin once for it to
Absolutely.
take off.
Well, why don't you go through and just tell us what these other variables are in the interest of time, and I'll certainly, put up on the screen and in the show notes the equation and an explanation of them. But why don't you just tell us what these other variables are quickly?
Well, okay, so the fraction of planets that have life, basically, we're doing that experiment right here in our own solar system. NASA's doing it now. If we find so much as a single microbe anywhere else in our solar system, or even, as I said earlier, in the depths of our own planet, that is not based upon life as we know it, not based upon DNA, RNA, or the same type of DNA and RNA, but is clearly sui generis, that is, it's of separate origin, just one microbe in our own solar system, and it would indicate or seem to indicate that life is ubiquitous.
Mm-hmm.
Moreover, we have to talk about the possibilities of interstellar panspermia. Now, panspermia is a real wild card. It means that life began one place and transferred to another place. So there's a real possibility, for example, that Mars began not on Earth, but life began not on Earth, but on Mars, and was transferred to Earth. A collision of some astronomical body, an asteroid or whatever, collides with Mars, a life-bearing Mars, kicking up dirt, rocks, so forth, that then sail through the solar system to land on Earth and basically infect Earth with Martian life. We could all be Martians. But by the same token, life could have evolved on an entirely separate solar system, another star system, and been transported here either on an interstellar rock like Oumuamua, or possibly intentionally, where those robotic probes that I talked about earlier may have seeded life here on our own planet, like a Johnny Appleseed or something. You take a planet that looks like it could, a new. These probes could be transiting the galaxy in the quest of new star systems, and basically seed all of the planets and moons in this new star system with life, and let it take where it will take, and don't take where it won't take, and evolve as it will everywhere, such that we ourselves are ET. Drake
Exactly. So what's the next variable?
Well, there's F sub C, which is the fraction of those planets with life that are communicating with us at this particular time. And honestly, I would prefer to think of it as the fraction of planets that are detectable by any means whatsoever. because rather than those that are communicating with us at this particular time. Partly because we have vast databases. We live in an era of data where there's just enormous amounts of data that's freely available, but no human being can possibly go through all of it. It needs to be sifted through with machine learning and algorithms to detect anything whatsoever that is anomalous. And now much or most of what is detected that is anomalous will turn out to have been a physical derivation. But some part of some detectable element of ET, the contrails of their interstellar world ships, the atmospheres filled with with technological ingredients or molecules that don't appear in nature, the anomalous shapes of objects in orbit around stars that, moons and planets come in spheres. They don't normally come in triangles.
But that leads me to ask if there, as a result of work that SETI's already done, if there is something mysterious or unexplained within the data so far, and have you been able to go through the mounds of data that you've collected? Is there anything anomalous that is there that is you just put over to the side and say, well, we don't know what that is exactly, but it's something?
Well, there are lots of things put aside that by astronomers who don't have SETI front of mind. So, for example, I personally have reason to believe that a great place to look for ET is around white dwarf stars. White dwarfs are the remnants of stars that have finished their normal
cycle.
normal cycle. And our sun will become a white dwarf at the end of time. Civilizations to survive the transition of their star to become a white dwarf. First, it would blow it out to become a red giant, and then it would shrink down into a white dwarf. In order to survive that, they would have to be very technologically advanced. And we may be able to detect ET, the products of that advanced civilization around white dwarf stars. But nobody, to my knowledge, is actually looking at white dwarfs yet in that sort of way.
Mm-hmm. But so SETI hasn't found anything that they would think is so anomalous that it could be ET, but you just don't know.
Well, fast radio bursts are mysterious still at this moment. So there are physical phenomenon that SETI scientists do look at and try to imagine that maybe they are the product of ET, because we don't have a good physical explanation for them yet. Some years ago, I received a call from a leading SETI scientist who swore me to secrecy before telling me that they were just about to announce, it was just about to be announced that a star was dimming in a way that seemed almost impossible. It was dimming by a factor of 22%, up to 22%. And this is what became known as Tabby's star, after the astronomer who first discovered this star in the Kepler field. To this day, we don't know why that star is dimming, but I think the preponderance of astronomers now believe that there's a dust cloud between between our line in our line of sight between ourselves and that star, which obscures, which dims that star without periodicity. And that was the key for me. And when that SETI scientist told me about it, I said, well, what's the periodicity? What's the orbit of that of the
dimming.
obstructing the dimming factor, the object that's obstructing this line of sight of the star? And he responded that there was no periodicity. There was, and that immediately settled the case for me that it couldn't possibly be any ET that I could imagine, that it wasn't orbiting a star, would just fall into it without a countervailing force and a lot of countervailing force. So there are anomalies like this. As I said, fast radio bursts are one right now that are being looked at, because not all some fast radio bursts seem to be attributable to Magnus stars, a type of neutron star, but some are real head scratchers. We don't know what they are, and some scientists have imagined that it could be a product of ET's technology.
Speaking of ET, so we have, in the realm of science fiction, just about every kind of iteration of ET. But of course, what's most popular in our, conversations and in our everyday conversations, of course, are UFOs or UAPs or whatever they're calling them these days.
Yeah.
What's your thought? I mean, you don't seem to be a believer in UFOs, but then you're spending all of your time in search of extraterrestrial intelligence. What's the difference between the two?
Right. Well, listen, I don't know a lot about UFOs, much more than I've read in the mainstream press in 60 Minutes and seen at the checkouts counter on the tabloids or something, but strictly from the point of view of astronomy, I've come to a very similar conclusion that our solar system is populated by alien probes. However, do I believe that alien probes have entered our atmosphere and are flying around? I haven't seen evidence that convinces me. I'm open to it, and certainly I'm sympathetic to the possibility, but I haven't seen anything that rises to the level of evidence that I would find persuasive. For one thing, we all carry around in our pockets terrific cameras, and so there are no convincing pictures of UFOs. Now you can say that our cell phone cameras are no good for taking pictures of very small objects flying fast in a fast way around the sky. And that's true. However, if there were 50 individuals each, looking at an indescribable dot zooming around the sky from different angles, and all of these people are strangers to one another, and it's not a conspiracy and so forth, I might find that persuasive. Or 50 people took out their cell phones on one side of an airplane and looked out the window and all took a picture of the same thing, even if every picture was blurry, the fact that there was 50 of them taken by 50 strangers to one another I would find persuasive.
Sure.
We have, I don't know how many satellites up there looking down on Earth, and none of them seem to have seen anything anomalous. They see airplanes, but they don't see anything resembling UFOs. With UFOs, doing the kind of acrobatics, you'd think that they would be, and with purported enormous accelerations, you'd expect to be hearing sonic booms.
Sure.
They have to obey the same law of nature as everybody else, and any object displacing air at a rapid rate causes a friction in the air, which causes a sonic boom. We don't hear them. I will say that if there were UFOs making these terrific accelerations, to my point, they must be artificial, robotic,
Sure.
rather than filled with little green men, because they would be crushed by the G-forces of the acceleration. I don't believe in a conspiracy of silence. that the government knows something, because the very first landings were in 1947. I think there have been 14 or so different presidential administrations since then. Every single person in every single administration kept the silence. I mean, Bill Clinton ran breathlessly in front of the cameras when he thought there was a little tiny microbe in a Martian rock.
Right.
What did and he wouldn't tell us about little green men that were in a hangar in Nevada. And what about Donald Trump? I mean, I don't know whether you love Donald Trump or hate Donald Trump, and I don't care. One thing we all know about Donald Trump, whether you love him or you hate him, is he's not going to keep his mouth shut about something like this. He would have told us.
Exactly. Well,
So
speaking
I just don't buy
of
the.
that kind of thing, segueing from UFOs, the other thing that science fiction has filled the thoughts and minds of people with is this idea of aliens colonizing the Earth or conquering the Earth or having nefarious plans or designs on the Earth. And you even in your Queen Bee analogy, talked about the possibility that there would be a civilization that just didn't want any other civilizations to advance, and they would annihilate civilizations as they came into their sphere of understanding or influence. I mean, really, how realistic is this, or are we, projecting the sickness of humanity onto aliens that we don't even know exist or have met yet?
uh, Physical conquest uh, by an alien civilization is not realistic. I very strongly believe that it's not possible. Uh, doesn't mean they can't harm us. As I said earlier, with their probes could absolutely be in a position to destroy the planet Earth with a toxin, self-replicating toxin or something, or even with a kinetic force by steering comets into our path. But I have a hard time believing that it would come here physically to colonize us. And the reason for that is the enormity of space and the enormity of the energy requirements. So, I mean, if you imagine just sending the International Space Station to the nearest star would take 50 million gigawatt hours of energy to accelerate it to just 1/10 of the speed of light, and it would need the same to decelerate it on its arrival, and that's without counting the fuel. We haven't talked about the fuel, which in any case would weigh more than the station itself, much more, many times more. If it was going at a slower rate, let's imagine a world ship where we sent. Let's look at an aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier carries about 6,000 crew members. A world ship would have to be much, much larger than that, carrying the same 6,000 people. Why would it have to be much larger? Because it would have to have agriculture to grow the food. It would have to have some factories. I'll talk about that for a second. We'd have to have raw materials. We'd have to have the fuel, which would be many times larger than the aircraft carrier size world ship itself. Have to have roomier quarters, I would imagine. It would take if it went at the speed of the Voyager spacecraft, it would take more than 100,000 years for it to arrive at a very close star, Barnard star, and that's roughly 4,200 human generations. 4,200 human generations. Each and every one of them, except for the very first one and the last one, would be born, live in their entire lives, and die on board this world ship. And every single atom on that world ship, since there's no possibility for resupply, would have to be perfectly recycled. So, for example, if you walk into my bedroom on this world ship, I'd have some toothpaste and a toothbrush and some sheets and pillows and a reading lamp and whatever. But I'm going to go through 200 toothbrushes in my life, and there are 4,200 generations. there's going to be a toothbrush factory, uh, and now there has to be a
Well,
light bulb factory, and
well,
growing.
couldn't there? But you've posited this notion that these probes could be sent out over these, uh, millions of years, and there would be a network. And this is probably another science fiction-ish esque uh, question, and I have two of them, and that is, isn't it possible that one of these probes could, or any of these networks of probes could have had, life forms on them, with containers the size of, an egg and a sperm from these species that could, eventually create the ET kind of life that could then, interact with our life, or even on a large scale, conquer another and colonize another, planet, as you talked about within the context of what was it, pan spermism,
Yeah.
or something like that. I mean, that's possible as well, isn't it, within the context of the paradigm that you were talking about with these probes?
Yes. I mean, your science fiction is as good as mine, but yes, I concede the point. It is possible. And consequently, we need to deal with any probe very cautiously, very, very cautiously. And in several of my papers and in my forthcoming book, I've argued that we need to, bring together an enormous cohort of experts to study these issues, and should be a standing committee of experts who can advise the UN. And I'm not speaking just astronomers. Let's perish that thought from the, everything up to the detection of ET is the proper purview of astronomy. Everything after the detection of ET is the purview of public policy. So astronomers can have a seat at the table, but only a seat. Such a committee of experts would include experts in national security, law, cryptology, behavioral psychology, game theory, economics, linguistics, evolutionary biology, diplomacy, emergency planning, religion, ethics, epidemiology, rocket and space science, mathematics, and on and on. It's not too early, believe me, it's already too late in the day to form a committee of experts to advise the United Nations, and that we should act in concert, because we have no contingency plans.
Mm-hmm.
Any of this, Don, nothing. I mean, there's no thought has been given, much less coherent plans. And those plans should be contingency plans should be devised now, rather than after the fact of detection, where we're acting in a state of shock, collective shock, where, and befuddlement, and may have to take instantaneous actions without knowing whether we should shoot it down or welcome it as an ambassador.
Well, I know the UN and NASA work together on this issue, and some time ago, when I was writing my science fiction book, I did send a note to the UN asking if there was such an organization that existed, and evidently there is. This was about, 5 or 6 years ago.
There is a committee on the peaceful uses of space, CAPUS, and it meets irregularly, a few times a year. It's only once and very briefly and tangentially taken up the subject of SETI. Doesn't have the onboard expertise necessary. So yes, there is a committee in place, but it's not doing the work.
Well, I'll send you what I found out from that. It was headed up by a young woman whose name is escaping me right now, but it is a diplomatic group or committee or small organization within the UN that's thinking about, how would we interact with extraterrestrials if it actually happened. I'll send you the reference that I have on that. The last thing I want to ask you, and it's a little down in the weeds in terms of the nexus between general relativity and quantum mechanics and cosmology. But people like Lee Smolin at the Perimeter Institute in Ontario posit this notion that in space, on the quantum level, there are these nodes that actually connect space, and that space is not empty. And of course, we know that that's true. But one of the consequences of this that's hypothesized is that if you understand this nodal system of how space is connected, that would facilitate the navigation of space in a much faster way than travel with the speed of light. And this sort of transcends science fiction. I mean, it's something that's actually really being worked on in a theoretical sense, with some sense of being able to come up with ideas that that would be consistent with reality. And I was just wondering if you were aware of some of these ideas with your interest in astronomy and cosmology. And I don't know if you know about the work of Lee Smolin and others that are working on this kind of thing.
Yes, I am generally familiar with it, but I don't think I have anything to comment on it, Don, to be honest, because
Okay.
it's just not my area of expertise.
No, I understand it. Then it's a difficult subject and somewhat mind-bending when you get down in the weeds of those kind of things. So I fully understand. Final question: what do you see in the future? How long before we're going to meet ET and shake hands?
Well, here's what I see in the future. I think that the future of SETI is in the search for technosignatures, rather than in the standard paradigm of looking for signals from another star. So that to me is SETI worth doing. There are vast, but there are vast databases now that can be mined. There's again, this vast sky surveys like Gaia, WISE, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, the Kepler
Hmm.
data. Vera Rubin is coming online that will create a vast. It's a telescope in Chile that will create a vast database. The SKA, Euclid, the planetary data system. There are many databases. Looking in those databases for anomalies is one of the futures of SETI. The other for me is to just look for probes within our own solar system. There's never been a search for them or a coherent search for them. We might look at the surface of the moon where we have sufficiently granulated photographic data to look for anything anomalous on the surface of the moon. I don't believe we have, it would have to be a fairly large probe if it was on the surface of Mars for the in terms of how granular the photo would have to be or is. So looking for probes within our own solar system I would look close to our sun, maybe in a close solar orbit, and for that
Hmm.
reason we've never seen it. We don't know that asteroids are asteroids. I don't want to start a new conspiracy theory, but the only thing we know about most small asteroids is that they reflect some light. We just
Right.
assume that they're asteroids.
Right.
We don't have any actual way of knowing that they're asteroids. We might look at the ratio of infrared heat that it generates and its albedo, or the amount of light that it reflects, and see if there's anything anomalous about any small asteroid. So that to me is sort of the future. Look, the SETI we're doing today, if you want to buy into the old paradigm, truthfully, the SETI that we're doing today is vastly more powerful than the SETI that we've done in the past.
Mm-hmm.
It's said it has been said, and I don't know that I've seen the backup for this, but I think it's if anything an understatement, that more SETI is being done today, every day, than used to be done in a year.
Mm-hmm.
There are really large and productive SETI searches going on right now by the SETI Institute using the VLA, but with breakthrough using a variety of telescopes by the Chinese and so forth. There's really large SETI programs going on now. And they're using more sophisticated algorithms due to Moore's law. The back end computing is more sophisticated and SETI is better funded today than it ever was before. Even though I could argue and should argue that it needs more funding, it is in fact much better funded than it ever was heretofore. So if we're going to make a detection, according to the old paradigm, we should be making it pretty soon. Even though when I say we've looked at a few million stars, that's only still a drop in the galactic bucket of 200 to 400 billion stars. Nonetheless, it would seem that if that paradigm is going to work, it's going to work out sooner rather than later. Unless the paradigm, as I've argued, is broken.
Understand. Well, I think it will happen eventually, maybe not in our lifetimes. John, thank you for joining Nature and Science podcast. This has been fascinating. You know, I could talk to you all day. And I look forward to your book coming out in August. I will certainly share it with our listeners on my website as well, and provide a link. I think it's going to be a fascinating book with your experience and background, and also good luck with your future Zorro films. As a fan of Zorro, I'll look forward to watching them.
All right. Thank you so much, Todd.
That's it for this episode of Nature and Science Podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, please hit that like button, and you can also subscribe at natureandsciencepodcast.com. Our next episode is all about a new approach to psychotherapy and the science behind that approach. I hope you'll join us. As always, stay safe, share happiness, and remember, science does care what you believe. Why? Science only seeks the truth, but it must be verifiable, leading to a much clearer view of reality.